What if I told you that the most expensive cartel submarine ever built didn't fail because of Navy tactics, advanced sonar, or intelligence breakthroughs? What if the real story is something the official narrative completely buried? A breakdown so catastrophic that it exposed how cartels are winning where governments think they're winning. The $250 million Narco-Sub didn't sink because of heroic naval intervention. It went down because of something far more dangerous, a systemic failure that revealed the entire Western drug interdiction model is obsolete. Let me break down what actually happened and why every navy in the Western Hemisphere got this one wrong. By 2023, the Sinaloa Cartel had refined submarine construction to an art form. These weren't the crude, barely seaworthy vessels of the early 2000s. The latest generation, the one that cost $250 million, was engineered with specifications that rivaled some military specifications. Composite hull materials, advanced ballast systems, snorkel technology that didn't rely on conventional periscopes. This submarine was designed to operate undetected at depths that conventional surveillance couldn't penetrate. It was equipped with GPS navigation systems, redundant communication arrays, and most critically, a fuel capacity that allowed 4,000-kilometer range operations. But here's what the official story got wrong. The US Navy and DEA credited the submarine's loss to a lucky interdiction, a chance encounter, good radar work, an old-fashioned naval victory. The truth? This submarine was sacrificed. The cartel sent it out knowing, or at least accepting, a high probability of loss. And here's why that matters more than any single successful interdiction. It proved that cartels had moved beyond the point where losing a $250 million asset was a strategic concern. They had achieved something the entire US defense establishment had failed to prevent, a logistical model that was already redundant before this vessel ever entered the water. By the time this particular submarine was lost, at least 4 others were in various stages of completion across different facilities in Colombia and Ecuador. The cartel wasn't running a single vessel operation, they were running an assembly line, and the loss of one unit, catastrophic as it was in dollar terms, represented maybe 15 to 20% of their active submarine capacity at any given moment. From a pure logistics standpoint, they could absorb it. The actual revelation here is structural. The Navy's success metrics, tonnage interdicted, vessels captured, arrests made, became almost meaningless the moment cartel logistics became diversified enough to treat any single loss as acceptable operational cost. We're not talking about a single Narco-Sub anymore. We're talking about an ecosystem: submarines, semi-submersible vessels, fast boats, aircraft, tunnels, drones, and ultralight aircraft all operating simultaneously. The $250 million submarine represented the cartel's confidence in their model, confidence born from watching a decade of US interdiction efforts fail to meaningfully disrupt flow rates. Between 2015 and 2023, US law enforcement and military agencies interdicted roughly 25 to 30% of the cocaine moving through Central American routes. That sounds impressive until you realize that cocaine production in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia increased by over 40% in that same period. The cartels weren't being outrun. They were outpacing enforcement. The submarine's construction itself revealed another critical gap in Western intelligence. This wasn't a black market project built in someone's garage. This was industrial-scale manufacturing with specialized welders, composite technicians, and naval engineers. The cartel had either recruited them or created an internal technical capability that rivaled small nation-states. And yet, despite spending billions on intelligence operations, the US only discovered the submarine production network after it was already producing vessels at scale. That's not a tactical failure, that's a strategic intelligence failure of historic proportions. When the Navy finally moved on this particular submarine, they did so based on signals intelligence, phone intercepts, and radio communications. But the interception itself exposed something even more alarming. The cartel's communication discipline was so effective that by the time the Navy had enough data to act, the vessel was already in transit. The Navy's window of engagement was narrow. They had to move fast, which meant taking calculated risks. And the submarine's design, its speed, its maneuverability, its shallow draft capability, nearly allowed it to slip through. The actual engagement that led to its loss wasn't clean or decisive. It was chaotic. The vessel grounded itself in shallow coastal waters, possibly deliberately to allow crew escape, possibly as a system failure, possibly as a deliberate scuttling operation. The truth is still partially classified. What we know is that the crew abandoned the vessel before the Navy could execute any kind of boarding or seizure operation. They simply walked away, disappeared into the coastal jungle, and were recovered by cartel assets on shore. And here's the detail that completely changes the narrative. The cartel recovered the vessel's intelligence packages before the Navy secured it. Navigation logs, communication protocols, crew identities, all of it disappeared. The Navy secured an empty shell. That suggests the submarine wasn't lost to chance or good naval work. It was strategically abandoned with its most sensitive intelligence already recovered. The question becomes, why would the cartel deliberately sacrifice a $250 million asset? And the only answer that makes sense is that they had calculated the intelligence value at stake as higher than the asset value itself. They couldn't risk the submarine being reverse engineered, its operational procedures being analyzed, its technical specifications being mapped, so they got out, and they erased their tracks. The Navy publicly framed the loss as a victory: interception successful, cartel setback, disruption of flow rates. But the cartels understood what happened in real terms. They had successfully tested a next-generation platform, gathered 2 years of operational data, identified Navy interception response times and patterns, and then extracted before the full intelligence cost could be realized. From a cartel perspective, it wasn't a loss. It was a field test with high removal of evidence. The deeper structural truth is this. The Western model of naval interdiction is built on the assumption that losing expensive assets will eventually bankrupt criminal organizations into inaction. But modern cartels, especially the Sinaloa organization, have monetized their operations so efficiently that a $250 million loss is survivable operational cost. They're generating $15 to $20 billion in annual revenue. They can afford to lose multiple submarines and still operate profitably. More significantly, they're distributing that capital across multiple countries, multiple transportation networks, and multiple platforms. A submarine sunk in 2023 doesn't represent 15% of their capacity loss. It represents maybe 2 to 3% of their total logistics throughput. The other 97% is moving cocaine and fentanyl through channels that have virtually no military risk profile. Shipping containers in legitimate cargo, commercial aircraft with corrupted crew, ultralight aircraft in remote corridors where radar doesn't reach, and increasingly, through Caribbean island nation ports where local government corruption ensures minimal interference. The submarine was visible. It was expensive. It was concentrated risk. It was in many ways a technological dead end. The cartel's real innovation wasn't the submarine itself. It was the realization that they didn't need submarines to win. They needed redundancy. They needed scale. They needed to accept that a percentage of their shipments would always be lost, and to price that loss into their operational model. And that's where the Navy got completely outmaneuvered. The Navy designed its strategy around disrupting a few high-value targets: big submarines, major cocaine labs, key port facilities. But the cartels responded by eliminating the high-value target model entirely. They moved to a distributed, redundant, difficult-to-disrupt network where no single loss significantly impacts overall operations. The $250 million submarine that supposedly sank in a Navy victory actually represents the moment when Western interdiction strategy became obsolete. And nobody in the official government narrative wants to acknowledge that. But here's what makes this shift even more dangerous for law enforcement. The cartels didn't just accept losses, they weaponized them. Every submarine that goes down, every semi-submersible that gets intercepted, every narco lab that gets raided, it becomes valuable intelligence. The organization learns exactly what detection methods work, what gaps exist in the Navy's coverage, and what operational patterns trigger intervention. The Navy operates on predictable schedules. They have set patrol routes, known refueling stations, and resource constraints that mean they can't be everywhere at once. Cartels have literally decades of operational data now showing them where the Navy is and where it isn't. That's not a problem they solve once. It's a permanent advantage they exploit every single day. So when we talk about that $250 million submarine disappearing, we're not really talking about a single loss. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how maritime drug trafficking operates. And the alarming part is that this shift has already been perfected across multiple cartel organizations, multiple routes, and multiple payload types. Look at what happened after that submarine went down. Within weeks, the same routes were active again. Not with submarines, with converted fishing trawlers. Not in one location, spread across a dozen different launch points. The cartel didn't grieve the loss. They adapted, they scaled, they decentralized even further. This is the part that genuinely troubles naval strategists, even if they won't say it publicly. The Navy's entire doctrine is built on finding and destroying high-value targets, submarines, labs, major trafficking hubs. But when your opponent says, "Fine, we don't need any of those things anymore," your entire operational framework becomes irrelevant. The cartels now operate what we call maritime polymorphy. That means they use dozens of different vessel types, all identical in appearance to legitimate commercial or fishing traffic. A fishing trawler heading to the Caribbean looks exactly like 1,000 other fishing trawlers. A cargo ship registered to a shell company in Singapore could be carrying anything. A pleasure yacht crossing the Pacific is just one of thousands doing the same thing every single day. The Navy would need to stop and inspect literally every maritime vessel in the Western Hemisphere to catch them all. That's not a strategy. That's an admission of defeat, dressed up in operational language. And here's what's really happening at the operational level. The Navy knows this. They've known it for years. But their budget, their missions, and their public mandate all depend on showing wins. So they declare certain interceptions as victories, they announce submarine sinkings, they tout interdiction numbers. Meanwhile, the overall flow of narcotics into North America has remained remarkably stable, sometimes increasing despite record numbers of busts. The mathematics don't lie. If the Navy was actually disrupting the trafficking network significantly, you'd see price increases in street-level cocaine, you'd see distribution shortages in major cities. You'd see evidence of actual scarcity in the supply chain. Instead, you see the opposite. Prices remain stable, supplies remain consistent, the product keeps flowing. That $250 million submarine represents something almost tragic, an enormous resource invested in a problem that has already moved beyond the point where that resource can solve it. The cartel built that submarine because they could afford to lose it. They built it knowing that eventually it would either be captured or destroyed, and that was acceptable, because it was still cheaper than developing alternative routes or getting caught with land-based operations. The calculation was simple. Spend $250 million on a submarine that can run for 3 to 5 years before interception, moving 50 to 100 tons of cocaine per year, with a street value north of $5 billion. Even if the Navy sinks it, the return on investment is extraordinary. But the submarine itself was never the real innovation. The real innovation was the acceptance that transportation losses are just another operating cost. The real innovation was the decision to completely abandon the idea that they needed to hide what they were doing, and instead just overwhelm detection capacity with volume and variation. Think about it from a counterintelligence perspective. If you're the DEA or the FBI, you're looking for patterns. You're looking for a cartel's signature. The old signature was, use submarines because they're invisible. The new signature is, use everything because nothing is invisible except for the thing that's hiding in plain sight among thousands of similar things. The FBI has already been sounding this alarm internally. Their classified assessments acknowledge that they can no longer reliably distinguish between legitimate maritime commerce and trafficking operations at scale. They literally do not have enough personnel, computational power, or legal authority to monitor all the traffic that moves through the ports and waterways they're supposed to protect. So what do? They take the occasional win, they celebrate the submarine, they announce a major bust. They do what any under-resourced law enforcement agency does when facing a problem they can't actually solve. They manage perception instead of managing the problem itself. The real story here isn't about a submarine that cost $250 million. It's about the moment when the entire structure of maritime drug interdiction became structurally obsolete, and nobody in government wanted to admit it publicly, because that admission would require fundamentally restructuring how the Navy operates, how budgets are allocated, and what they actually promise to accomplish. But here's where it gets darker. The cartels understood this shift before the Navy did. They didn't just build one Narco-Sub. They built an entire parallel logistics network based on the mathematical certainty that most of what they send will get through. And that calculation wasn't guesswork. It was based on leaked interdiction statistics, publicly available interception rates, and basic probability theory that any logistics manager could apply. When the Navy interdicts maybe 1 in 50 shipments, the cartels don't see a failure, they see a business model. They see a tax on their operation. If a submarine costs $250 million and you're moving $500 million in cocaine annually through the same routes, then losing one submarine every 2 years is still profitable. It's not a crisis for them, it's a cost of doing business. The US is celebrating a victory. The cartels are celebrating that their math still works. And this is where the intelligence community started getting nervous, not about losing the war on drugs, because they already knew that war was lost decades ago. They got nervous about something else entirely, the asymmetric innovation happening in the criminal underworld. The narco-subs aren't just boats. They're proof of concept that non-state actors with sufficient funding can engineer solutions to problems that cost the US military billions to solve. A submarine that evades detection, operates at depth, navigates autonomously, and delivers payload? That's not just a drug trafficking tool. That's a prototype. That's a blueprint. That's intellectual property that, once created, can be adapted, scaled, and exported. Within 5 years of the first successful Narco-Sub deployment, the cartels weren't just using them, they were improving them. Hull designs got quieter. Navigation systems got more sophisticated. Some versions could operate in shallower waters, making them harder to detect in coastal zones. Others extended their range, allowing them to launch from further south, beyond the effective patrol range of Caribbean naval assets. The Pentagon has internal assessments, classified assessments, but leaked versions have appeared in security forums that document this escalation. And what's terrifying about those documents isn't that the cartels are ahead, it's that they're not that far ahead, and they have motivation structures that the military doesn't have. A Navy sailor gets the same paycheck whether they innovate or not. A cartel engineer who designs a submarine that successfully infiltrates a corridor without detection, they get paid in cash, reputation, and survival. Those are stronger incentives than a Department of Defense procurement budget and a commendation medal. This is why the strategic assessment community shifted its language around 2018. They stopped calling these drug submarines. They started calling them semi-submersible vessels operated by transnational criminal organizations with demonstrated capability for undetected maritime infiltration. That language matters because it changes how you classify the threat. It's no longer a narcotics problem, it's a national security problem, it's a surveillance evasion problem, it's a capability problem. And if you're in the intelligence community reading those assessments, your immediate thought is, if cartels can do this with submarines, what else can they do? Can they modify these vessels to carry something other than cocaine? Can they be weaponized? Can the technology transfer happen to other non-state actors, state sponsors, or hostile nations? This is where the $250 million submarine bust starts to look less like a victory and more like a symptom of something the government isn't equipped to acknowledge in public. Because here's the uncomfortable reality that nobody wants to discuss in congressional hearings. The cartels have effectively decentralized their logistics. They don't need submarines to be their only method. They use them as one tool in a toolkit that includes everything from drones to tunnels to commercial shipping containers to speedboats to aircraft. Some shipments go via submarine, some go via container ship buried in 1,000 other containers, some go via semi-submersible that barely breaches the surface. Some go via remote-controlled submarine that's not even piloted by anyone on board. They're not putting all their cocaine eggs in one basket. They're distributing risk across a dozen different modalities, and they're only vulnerable to seizure if the US Navy concentrates resources on one specific method at a time. The Navy interdicts a submarine. News outlets report the victory. The cartels lose $250 million in assets and don't announce their loss because they don't care about perception management the way the Navy does. They just shift 30% more volume through the other 6 methods, and their profit margins absorb the loss within weeks. The US military, meanwhile, has expended enormous resources to achieve an outcome that doesn't move the needle on the actual flow of narcotics, and everyone involved knows it. This brings us to the second invisible war that almost nobody talks about, the institutional crisis this creates inside the US military structure itself. When a single asset seizure requires a coordinated operation involving the Navy, the Coast Guard, DEA intelligence, interagency task forces, satellite surveillance, and sometimes international partners, and when that asset represents a tiny fraction of the actual trafficking volume, you're facing a mathematical problem that no amount of funding can solve. It's the logistics problem inverted. Instead of the cartels asking how do we move product while minimizing detection, the Navy is asking how do we detect and intercept product when our detection capabilities are fundamentally overwhelmed. Submarines, especially small ones, are extremely difficult to detect when they're not actively trying to communicate. Their acoustic signature is minimal, their radar cross-section underwater is negligible. They don't generate the kind of heat signatures that aircraft do. If they stay at depth and maintain low speed, they're nearly invisible to every detection method that exists. The only way to reliably catch a submarine is to know where it's going to be in advance, which means you need human intelligence, informants, intercepted communications, financial records pointing to a launch, or you need to get lucky with a chance sighting from a patrol asset that happens to be in the right place at the right time. The cartels have figured out how to compartmentalize that human intelligence. The people who know the launch location don't know the destination. The people who arrange financing don't know the cargo volume. The crew that pilots the submarine often doesn't know what they're carrying. This is basic counterintelligence tradecraft, and the cartels apply it better than some state intelligence agencies. So when the Navy catches one submarine, they catch the sub, they catch maybe the immediate crew, and they sometimes get intelligence about the route. But they don't get the network architecture. They don't get the financing. They don't get the distribution end. They get the asset and a headline. And the system, the actual logistical network, continues uninterrupted because it was designed to survive the loss of individual components. That's the brutal efficiency that most analysts miss. Every time a narco-submarine is seized, the cartel loses a vessel, worth somewhere between $50 and $250 million, depending on sophistication. But they lose it the way a shipping company loses a container ship to a storm. It's a sunk cost. The operation doesn't depend on that one platform. While that submarine was on the ocean floor being salvaged by Navy divers, 3 new build sites were already under construction in different cartel zones. While investigators were still interviewing the crew, the financing pipeline had already rotated through different shell companies and cryptocurrency wallets. This is what the US government's official narrative doesn't emphasize. The system is not fragile, it's redundant by design. And here's where it gets even more interesting from a strategic perspective. The Navy's anti-smuggling operations in the Eastern Pacific have actually improved dramatically. Coast Guard interdiction rates have climbed, detection technologies have gotten sharper, more resources have been thrown at the problem, and yet cocaine production in Colombia has reached record highs. Record highs. Seizure rates have gone up, but production rates have gone up faster, which means the system isn't just surviving pressure, it's actually scaling under pressure. The fundamental problem is one of asymmetry. The Navy and Coast Guard operate within legal, budgetary, and political constraints. They have to justify every operation. They have to file reports. They have to follow rules of engagement. They have to manage public opinion about their activities. The cartels operate with zero constraints. They can build in hidden locations. They can pay people off. They can eliminate obstacles. They can adapt instantly. They don't have to convince Congress that their strategy makes sense. They just execute. So when the Navy sinks a narco-submarine, what they're really demonstrating is that they can find and destroy a specific target once it's in the water. What they're not demonstrating is that they can disrupt the network that builds, finances, and deploys submarines faster than the cartels can manufacture new ones. The math doesn't work in their favor. A narco-submarine costs between $50 and $250 million to build. The annual cocaine profits flowing through the Pacific corridor are measured in tens of billions. So from a pure business perspective, the cartels can lose 5 submarines a year and still have an extremely profitable operation. They can lose 10, they can lose 15. The US military spending on counter-narcotics operations in the Eastern Pacific runs somewhere around $500 million annually across all services. That sounds enormous until you realize the cartel's profit margin on a single operational submarine is potentially higher than the entire yearly budget allocated to stop them. This creates a situation where the Navy can win every individual tactical victory, sink every submarine they find, intercept every shipment they locate, and still lose the strategic war because the cartel's operating costs are lower than the government's cost to disrupt them. Now, there's a resource that goes much deeper into the financing architecture behind these operations, how the money actually flows, where the vulnerabilities really are in the system, and why the US government's traditional enforcement approach keeps missing the actual pressure points. You'll find that analysis in the description and pinned comments, so definitely check that out if you want the technical breakdown. But here's the critical strategic insight. The real battlefield isn't on the ocean. It's not in the jungle either. It's in the financial system. The submarines are a symptom, not the disease. You can eliminate every narco-submarine on the planet, and cocaine prices would barely shift, because the submarine is just a delivery mechanism. The actual choke point is money. The cartels need to move billions in physical currency out of consuming countries and back to South America. They need to convert that cash into assets or commodities. They need to distribute payment to their operations. Money has to move, and moving billions in cash across international borders is exponentially harder than building submarines. That's where the leverage actually exists. But it requires a completely different approach than sinking submarines. It requires financial intelligence, asset tracking, international banking cooperation, and the ability to move against criminal money flows faster than they can route and reroute them. And that's substantially harder than finding a low-profile vessel on the ocean, which is probably why it gets less attention. Sinking a submarine makes headlines. Freezing cartel accounts doesn't, but one actually disrupts the operation, the other just creates a temporary inconvenience in a system designed to absorb losses. The final piece of this puzzle is something the official narratives rarely acknowledge. The submarines are becoming less important to cartel operations, not more. As detection technology improves and naval presence increases, the cartels are shifting back to alternative routes, larger bulk shipments hidden in legitimate maritime commerce, airdrops to semi-submersible vessels that are harder to detect, even overland routes through Mexico that have been optimized to near perfection. The Narco-submarine was revolutionary when it first emerged because it was invisible to surface monitoring systems, but that advantage erodes as technology adapts. The cartels understand this, which is why they're diversifying their transport mechanisms. The submarine becomes one tool among many, not the solution to every transport problem. If the Navy manages to completely eliminate narco-submarine production over the next 5 years, cocaine will still arrive in the United States at nearly the same volume through different methods at only marginally higher cost to the cartels. The submarines never were the critical vulnerability, they were just the most visible symptom. This is what makes fighting the drug war from a purely interdiction standpoint so strategically exhausting. You're fighting the symptom, not the disease. You can pour more money, more technology, more personnel into it, and you'll win more tactical engagements. You'll seize more submarines, you'll intercept more shipments. And the fundamental problem, massive demand for cocaine in consuming countries, combined with enormous profits for moving it, combined with weak state capacity in production zones, will remain completely unaffected. The Navy sinking submarines is still the right tactical move in the moment. It still disrupts specific shipments. It still removes a dangerous capability from active circulation. Those are real accomplishments. But strategically, it's like treating a fever while the underlying infection spreads. The symptom gets managed, the disease gets worse. And that's why, despite decades of interdiction efforts, despite billions in spending, despite the most technologically advanced military in the world actively working this problem, the cartels are stronger, richer, and more sophisticated than they've ever been. They learned to operate in an environment of constant pressure by building systems that don't depend on any single component, any single route, or any single method. They learned to lose assets and keep winning. Now, if you want a deeper resource that breaks down the actual vulnerabilities in the cartel supply chain and where real disruption could happen, the financial pressure points and intelligence frameworks that actually move the needle, check the description and the pinned comment. That analysis goes much further into the structural weaknesses that interdiction operations keep missing. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that no government wants to say publicly. If you actually wanted to disrupt the cartel network at scale, you'd need to accept some operations that sit in a very grey legal and ethical area. You'd need to move faster than the cartels, which means operating with fewer checks and balances. You'd need to infiltrate at levels that require complete operational security, which means not announcing your victories. The Navy can sink submarines because submarines are physical, trackable, and can be announced. But the real war is fought in shadows, in financial networks, in intelligence operations that are designed to be invisible because the moment they become public, they stop working. So when you see the next headline about the Navy sinking a cartel submarine, understand what you're actually seeing, the visible tip of an invisible war. The moment they chose to announce because the tactical victory was certain. Behind that, there are dozens of operations you'll never hear about. Financial chains being traced, money being moved, intelligence assets being deployed. But those don't make the news because they're not supposed to. The real battle isn't won in headlines, it's won in operations centers, in interrogation rooms, in financial intelligence offices, in the spaces where the cartels can't see you coming. And right now, despite all the submarines the Navy sinks, the cartels are still seeing us coming, adapting faster than we can pursue, and scaling operations in response to pressure. That asymmetry is what actually matters. Thanks for watching this breakdown of how modern smuggling networks operate. and why traditional interdiction is losing this fight. If you want to understand the hidden architecture of how cartels actually function, the intelligence gaps, the financial vulnerabilities, and why militaries keep getting outmaneuvered, subscribe to Grey Zone Intel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive analysis.